Hey true crime fans, my name is Freddy. Welcome to my channel Forensic Connections. If you're new here and you're a true crime fan like me, I'd like to invite you to hit that like button and subscribe. That way you'll be notified each time I put out a new video. I really hope you enjoyed my first video on the wood chipper murder of Helle, and if you haven't seen that yet, I'll leave the link to it in the description below. Now this week I'm bringing you a murder back from 1992, and that is the murder of Caren Campano. Now this is a treat for the true crime fan because there isn't many videos out on it. Now this murder is extremely sad and excessively gruesome. And if you haven't heard about it before, I'm here to tell you about it now, and how the Forensic Connection helped capture her true killer. Let's jump right in. Caren Campano was a beautiful 42-year-old woman, mother, and friend, born July 15, 1949. Working a decent paying job at a credit adjustment company in Oklahoma City, where she resided. She had been married 3 times and had 3 kids. At the time of her disappearance, she was married to Christopher Campano, who was 15 years younger than her at the time. Weirdly, Chris was introduced to her by his own mother, as Caren and her were close friends. At the age of 27, Chris was known to be a drifter with barely any income, but had a pretty bad drug addiction. Caren and Chris were known to argue often. Their neighbors were familiar with the sound of them going at it at the top of their lungs. With that being said, on the night of her disappearance, it seemed like just another normal argument to the neighbors. This time, the argument was about Chris's use of drugs. She wanted him to go into a drug treatment program. According to Chris, they both left the apartment that night between the heated argument to cool off and get some time apart, which wasn't unusual for them. Caren Campano left on foot, and Chris left in his truck, headed to a local bar to have a few drinks. The next morning, Chris woke up to no Caren, so he decided to call her place of employment to see if she had showed up for her shift. The supervisor informed him that she had not. Neither did she call in to say she wasn't coming. Upon gaining this information, Chris, worried, decided to ring the local police department to file a missing persons report. When the police arrived to the apartment to take Chris's statement, they took a quick look around and noted that there was no sign of foul play. But Chris made it a point to notify the police that their home had been burglarized a few nights before and a few important items were missing. The police felt a bit suspicious and decided to ask Chris to sign a waiver to be able to search the house for any evidence or clues that may help them figure out what exactly happened to Caren Campano. According to one of the investigators, the very first thing they noticed when they walked into the Campano bedroom was a big white bag next to the bed frame. When they moved that bag, the investigators found the very first forensic connection in this case. Under the bag was a big brown stain consistent with blood. Now, investigators carry with them a variety of items when they go execute a search warrant to be able to process items on scene. And one of these items is called a hemastick. Now, a hemastick is a little strip that they use to test for the presence of blood. Now, we're talking 1992. Forensics wasn't as advanced as it is now, present day 2023. And the hemastick isn't able to tell you whether the blood that it finds is human or not. It's just able to tell you that blood is present. So they decided to cut a piece of the carpet off and take it to forensic laboratories to undergo a species test to determine whether the blood was human or animal. Now, upon doing the species test, investigators were able to determine that the blood on the Campano's bedroom rug did indeed come from a human. Instantly, police had a hunch that the blood on the carpet came from Caren Campano. With that being said, Chris's story wasn't really adding up. Investigators knew that Chris knew more than what he was telling them. The bartender that was working that night made a statement that said that he did not recall seeing Chris that night at all. Not only that, but upon further investigation, investigators found out that Chris had pawned some of Caren Campano's jewelry the morning after her disappearance. The police didn't have much to go on, but they were able to run more tests on the Campano residents, which did not have many signs of physical violence. The investigators knew they were heading in the right direction though. Back in 1992, as I said, forensics was still pretty much in its infancy compared to what it is now. Forensic investigators still had plenty of tests they could run to determine what has happened at a suspected scene of a crime. Now, one of these tests is involving a substance called luminol, and you'll hear more and more about it while watching Forensic Connections, because that's one of my favorite tests. Now, luminol is a substance used to determine whether blood was present and was cleaned up by bleach or soap, anything. You could wipe and wipe and wipe. The amazing thing about luminol is no matter how much you wipe, when they run that luminol test, it will show. Now, when the test is run, the blood reacts with the luminol and shows up as a fluorescent glow wherever the blood was present. Back at this time, this test needed to be run in complete darkness, so investigators had to wait till nighttime to run the test at the Campano residence. Upon nightfall, the investigators decided to start their test, where they originally found the blood-stained carpet in the Campano bedroom. Now, for reference, they took pictures before and after, and the results were incredibly gruesome. Now, this is what it looked like before the test, and this is what it looked like after. The luminol test pretty much told the story of what had sadly happened to beautiful Caren Campano. There was blood on the walls, blood on the ceiling, blood on the doors, blood on the furniture. As sad as it is, the blood spatter and trails told investigators the story of what had happened in that bedroom. Someone had been beaten to death with a blunt object. They applied the luminol test to the rest of the house also, and what it uncovered was incredibly sad. There was a swipe of blood that was on the kitchen door consistent with someone being carried in their head, possibly swiping against that door. From there, the body was dropped to the ground and dragged from the utility room down the back steps, all the way through the outside steps, past the driveway until the trail stops. We all know that it's Caren Campano who was murdered, obviously, but investigators, as obvious as it may seem, can't jump to conclusions. They have to run tests in order to know whose blood that actually is. At this point, they didn't have a body nor a murder weapon. So that being said, investigators wouldn't be able to prove that an actual murder was committed. Now, the beauty of forensics is there's always different tests they can run in order to build a solid case and make sure that they're correct. Investigators decided to go back and do a measurement test to determine how much blood had to be let out on that carpet in order to make that stain. Investigators wanted to make sure that they were spot on, so they used a piece of actual carpet from the bedroom and a weight to simulate a human head, and they poured actual human blood on it until it measured to the same size stain from the original blood stain they found under the bag on that carpet. The amount of blood it took to even make that stain is 40% of the blood inside of a woman the size of Caren Campano. If a human loses 40% of its blood at once, they will not be able to survive. After this test, investigators were certain that a murder took place at the Campano residence. So now that they knew that a murder took place there, they had to make certain that the blood in that house was Caren Campano's blood. Unfortunately, the police did not have a sample of Caren Campano's blood. The police decided to involve the FBI. The FBI obtained blood from Caren Campano's mother and her sisters, and her 3 children, and one of her ex-husbands. Through various DNA tests, the investigators were able to match up the blood from Caren Campano's family to the blood that was found at the Campano residence. Through DNA testing, even though they did not have an actual person's DNA sample, they were able to accurately compare samples from family members, since family members share a mixture of the same DNA. 8 months after the disappearance of Caren Campano, investigators were able to conclude that Chris had brutally murdered his wife that night in that home, and he was arrested. Chris had a mountain of evidence compiled against him. The neighbors hearing the argument, his weak alibi that fell apart, the fact that he pawned some of Karen's jewelry literally the morning after her disappearance, and the forensic connection, which is the bloodbath discovered by the luminol test in their home. The prosecutors in this case say that Caren Campano never left her house for a walk, as Chris had stated. Instead, they believe that Caren Campano and Chris were arguing, first possibly in the living room when neighbors heard them, then moved to the bedroom. In the bedroom, Chris lost control and got violent, grabbed a weapon and repeatedly struck Caren over the head. As he was swinging whatever weapon he used, the weapon produced cast-off blood trails on the walls and ceiling. After striking her, they believe she fell and hit her head on the bedpost, then proceeded to hit the ground with her head on the carpet. Her head started to bleed profusely, which is what produced the big old blood stain that investigators first saw under the white bag. While his wife lay there bleeding to death, Chris then left and went to a local bar to pass the time until the neighbors went to sleep. When he got back home, he wrapped Karen's body up in the bedsheet and tied it with a telephone wire, and carried her body all through the house, carelessly. Her body was swiping against walls and doors, which is how those blood trails were left all through the house. When he passed the kitchen, he proceeded to drop the body on the floor and drag her the rest of the way out the back, through the driveway and to his car. Then he went to dispose of the body. He possibly dumped it somewhere far. When he returned, he washed away any visible blood outside and inside of the house. Investigators believed that they had a pretty solid case against Chris and could convict him even without the body of Caren Campano. Though convicting someone of a murder is pretty difficult for any prosecutor to do without having a body. But just as the trial began, investigators got a huge break. They found the body of Caren Campano. I'm pretty sure this is the first time that this has ever happened. Speaking of the body of a murder victim being found literally as the trial begins, that's crazy. The body was found by a couple of kids riding dirt bikes in a remote area on the side of the interstate. Luckily, where the body lay, there wasn't much grass or plants, which made it stand out. Had the grass been any taller, that body would have never been found in time. It was wrapped in white blankets and skeletonized. Since the body was skeletonized, they weren't able to tell whether it was Caren Campano or not. But there was one giveaway. The body lay on top of a piece of a paper check. Though there wasn't enough to see who the check was made out to, they were able to read that the check was from a Shell oil company and made out to someone in New York. The check was in the amount of $83.34. Everyone already knew that Caren Campano was from New York, and the investigators later found out that her family had part interest in a Shell oil company. How crazy is that? They couldn't go solely on the check though, so they had to use the teeth that were left in that skull of the body, which luckily the body still had the entire set of the teeth. Forensic investigators were able to compare the dental records with the set of teeth found on the skeletal remains. Luckily, Caren Campano's dentist was very thorough when keeping dental records, which made the identification process a lot easier. To be more precise in the identification process, forensic investigators used DNA from the bone marrow of the skeleton to compare to Caren's, which left without a doubt that the body found, sadly, was that of Caren Campano. With the body found added to all the forensic evidence that the investigators had, Chris saw no other choice but to confess to the murder of his wife, Caren Campano. Chris went on trial in 1994. The jury found him guilty of manslaughter rather than the original first-degree murder charge he had. And the reason being is because this wasn't at all planned out. It was too messy of a crime. It was a spur-of-the-moment situation. Don't think the judge was any less lenient on him because of the manslaughter charge. Chris received 1,000 years in prison, which is one of the most longest sentences in American history. I'd like to thank you for joining me in this video. If you stuck it out with me this far, please hit the like button if you'd like the content that I put out today. And please comment below what your favorite case solved by forensic science is of all time. I chose this case to talk about because it's not talked about very often, and I'd like to keep Caren Campano's name alive to raise domestic violence awareness. If you or someone you know is going through a domestic violence situation, don't just sit there. Please take action and say something before it's too late. I've also chosen this case because if it wasn't for forensic science and all the forensic connections in this case, Chris would have got off scot-free. He would have probably blamed the murder on, who knows, the burglars, he said, and he would have been free today. Who knows what story he would have made up. So a big shout out to forensic investigators and forensic science for sealing the deal in this case. I have another forensic connection case for you next week. Thank you all, and remember, if you commit a crime, the forensic connection is always going to be there. Thank you, and stay safe.